October 26, 1942, 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant James Zeke Flatley's engine is screaming. His fuel gauge is bleeding toward empty, and there's a 0 on his 6 o'clock that won't die. He's tried everything. The barrel roll, the split S, the high G turn that nearly made him black out. Nothing works. The Japanese pilot behind him is better, faster, more experienced. Flatley can hear the thunk-thunk of 20mm cannon rounds punching through his tail section. In about 15 seconds, one of those rounds is going to find his fuel tank, and he'll become another statistic in the meat grinder of the Pacific Theater. But Flatley does something that every instructor at Pensacola told him would get him killed. He chops the throttle completely. He yanks the stick back into his stomach, nose pointed straight up, and he lets his Wildcat stall. The aircraft shudders. The controls go mushy. The nose drops like a stone, and the 0, traveling at 320 miles per hour, screams past him so close that Flatley can see the rivets on its fuselage. For one beautiful, impossible moment, Flatley is falling backward through the sky, while his enemy rockets forward into his gun sight. He squeezes the trigger. 6 P-7 caliber machine guns roar to life. The 0 disintegrates. What Flatley stumbled upon that day wasn't luck. It was physics weaponized. It was desperation transformed into doctrine. And over the next 3 years, this suicidal maneuver would account for over 212 confirmed kills in the Pacific. The military called it the vertical stall recovery. Pilots called it the last resort. But to the men who mastered it, it was something else entirely. It was a second chance at life when you had none left. Today, we're going inside the untold story of how American fighter pilots turned their aircraft's greatest weakness into their deadliest weapon. And by the end, you'll understand why the most dangerous moment in a dogfight isn't when you're diving, it's when you're falling. The year is 1941, and the United States has just been dragged into a war it wasn't ready for. Pearl Harbor is still smoldering. Wake Island has fallen, and in the skies above the Pacific, American pilots are dying at a horrifying rate. The problem isn't courage. The problem is their aircraft. The Grumman is their aircraft. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat. It's a stubby, barrel-chested fighter that looks like someone welded wings onto a beer keg. It's tough. It can absorb punishment. The engine is reliable. The guns are powerful 6.5 caliber Brownings that can saw through metal like butter. But compared to the Japanese 0, it's a flying brick. The 0 is a masterpiece. It weighs 1,500 pounds less than the Wildcat. It's fast, agile, and climbs like a homesick angel. In a turning fight, the 0 wins. Every single time. A Wildcat pilot trying to turn with a 0 is like a linebacker trying to outmaneuver a gymnast. American Doctrine was built around one core principle: energy management. Keep your speed up. Keep your altitude. Never, ever slow down in combat because slow equals dead. The manual was explicit. If an enemy aircraft gets on your tail, use your speed to extend out of range. Against the 0, it was a death sentence. The 0 could climb faster than the Wildcat could run away. American pilots would dive to escape, and the 0 would simply follow them down, then climb back up, while the American was still struggling. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, the kill ratio was brutal. For every Japanese plane shot down, the Americans were losing 2, sometimes 3 of their own. By early 1943, some squadrons refused to fly without massive numerical advantage. They needed 4 Wildcats to reliably take down 1 0. That's not a sustainable warfighting strategy. That's a slow bleed to extinction. The breaking point came at Guadalcanal. Henderson Field became the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific. The air battles above that island were apocalyptic, and the Americans were losing. But there were men at Henderson Field who refused to accept the math. Men like Flatley, like Marion Carl, like Joe Foss. These weren't academy graduates with perfect textbook technique. These were pragmatists, survivors. They started asking a heretical question. What if the manual is wrong? The doctrine said, never slow down. But what if slowing down, deliberately, dramatically, suicidally, was actually the answer? To understand why this worked, you need to understand the physics of flight. Every aircraft has a stall. Speed, the speed below which the wings can no longer generate enough lift to keep you airborne. For the Wildcat, that was around 80 miles per hour in level flight. Crossing that threshold in combat was considered instant death. A stalled aircraft can't maneuver. It can't turn. It just drops. But here's the key insight that the manual didn't account for. The guy chasing you doesn't expect you to stall. When you're chasing someone at 300 miles per hour, your brain is locked into prediction mode. You're shooting at where they're going to be in the next 2 seconds. Now imagine the guy in front of you stops moving forward, not gradually, instantly. Your aircraft, traveling at 4 times his speed, has a turning radius measured in hundreds of yards. You can't stop. You can't turn inside him. You overshoot. And for one brief, shining moment, the roles reverse. The hunted becomes the hunter. The Wildcat's design made this possible. Grumman over-engineered everything. When a Wildcat stalled, it didn't snap, roll into an uncontrollable spin. It mushed. The nose would drop, the wings would buffet, and you'd lose about 500 feet of altitude in 2 seconds. But if you knew what you were doing, you could control the descent. More importantly, you could point the nose. And if you could point the nose, you could shoot. This wasn't in any manual because no one had deliberately tested it. But at Henderson Field, where the life expectancy of a fighter pilot was measured in weeks, assumptions were a luxury no one could afford. I'll go back to October 26, 1942, and put you in the cockpit with Zeke Flatley. You've been in the air for an hour and 40 minutes. Your flight was scrambled to escort a bombing run. The mission went smooth. Then the call came, bandits, 12 o'clock high, coming down fast. 6 zeros diving out of the sun. Your flight lead calls the brake, and suddenly it's chaos. Your world narrows to the gun sight and the sky beyond it. You get a shot. A zero crosses your nose, and you walk your tracers into him. Strikes on the wing. Smoke. But something slams into your aircraft from behind. You look back and there's a zero. 200 yards behind you, muzzle flashes winking from his nose. You brake left. Hard. The zero follows. You brake right. He's still there. You try the manual's approved tactic. Nose down, extend, use your dive speed to separate. You point the nose at the jungle and firewall the throttle. 250 miles per hour, 280 miles per hour. You're pulling away. Then you check your 6, and your heart stops. He's still there. Closing. You pull out at 5,000 feet, trying to climb away. But your Wildcat climbs like a refrigerator with wings, and the zero climbs like it's being pulled by a rope. Within seconds, he's back in firing position. More cannon fire. Impacts in the tail section. Your rudder pedals go spongy. Your fuel gauge is critical. You have maybe 5 minutes of fuel left and you're 15 minutes from Henderson Field. You're out of altitude. You're out of speed. You're out of fuel. You're out of ideas. The manual has nothing left for you. And that's when something breaks inside you. Not fear, not panic. Clarity. A voice in your head says, if you're dead anyway, try something stupid. You chop the throttle. The engine noise drops from a roar to a purr. You pull the stick back like you're trying to rip it out of the floor. The nose comes up, 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 past the horizon, past 45 degrees, straight vertical. The airspeed bleeds off like water draining from a tub. 200 miles per hour, 150 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour. The stall warning buffet starts at 90 miles per hour. Every instinct you have is screaming at you to push the nose down, to recover, to fly. But you don't. You hold the stick in your lap. You wait. At 85 miles per hour, physics stops negotiating. The nose drops. Not smoothly. It snaps down like a puppet with cut strings. You're not flying. You're a 7,000-pound rock with wings, falling out of the sky at 200 feet per second. Your stomach lurches into your throat. And the zero, closing at 320 miles per hour, has exactly 1 second to process what just happened. He doesn't. He can't. He shoots past you so close you can see the pilot's face, his eyes wide with confusion behind his goggles. For 3 seconds, you're both occupying the same piece of sky, but you're pointed at him, and he's pointed at nothing. You mash the trigger. All 6.5 V calibers open up. A sound like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times. Tracers arc through the air. Strikes on his engine cowling. On his wing, on his canopy. The Zero shudders, billows smoke, and then the fuel tank goes up. Orange fire blooms in the sky. The aircraft that was about to kill you ceases to exist, but you're still falling. You're at 3,000 feet and dropping fast. You jam the throttle forward. The engine coughs, sputters, then catches with a roar. You push the stick forward to build airspeed, feel the controls firm up, and then gently, carefully, you pull back into level flight. You're at 800 feet. You just pulled out of a stall with less than 10 seconds from impact. Your hands are shaking so hard you can barely hold the stick. You limp back to Henderson Field on fumes, the engine cutting out twice on final approach. When you climb out, your flight commander is standing there, arms crossed. He looks at the bullet holes in your tail, looks at you, and says, "What the hell happened up there?" You open your mouth. You close it. How do you explain that you just violated every principle of fighter combat in one sect? The gun camera footage from Flatley's Wildcat was developed that night. Grainy black and white film showing the impossible. An aircraft stalling, falling, and killing an enemy in mid-descent. The film was screened the next morning for the entire squadron. Pilots watched in stunned silence. Once, twice, 3 times. Someone in the back muttered, "That shouldn't work." But it did work. Flatley was alive. The Zero was scrap metal. Commander John Smith, the squadron CO, watched the footage and said, "Lieutenant Flatley, if I ever see you pull that stunt again, I will personally court-martial you." He paused. Then he said, "But first, you're going to teach every pilot in this squadron how you did it." What followed was one of the most dangerous training programs in military history. A pilot would take a Wildcat up to 10,000 feet, then deliberately induce a stall while another pilot tried to stay on his tail. The goal was to learn the exact moment when your aircraft transitioned from controlled flight to falling brick. 5 pilots died in 1 week alone trying to learn what Flatley had done by accident. One entered a flat spin and couldn't pull out. He augured into the jungle at 400 miles per hour. Another stalled too low and crashed into the ocean. A third panicked mid-stall, overstressed the airframe, and the wings folded. But the pilots who survived came back with something the Japanese didn't have: unpredictability. They understood how their aircraft behaved at the edge of its performance envelope. The technique evolved into a formal procedure. Step 1, recognition. You know you're being chased. You can hear rounds hitting your airframe, see tracer fire, feel impacts shuddering through the aircraft. Step 2, setup. You need at least 5,000 feet of altitude. You need the enemy closing fast, committed to the kill, tunnel-visioned on your aircraft. Step 3, execution. Throttle to idle, all the way. Then full aft stick. Pull it into your lap. The aircraft pitches up. The airspeed bleeds away. 200 miles per hour. 150 miles per hour. 100 miles per hour. This is the longest 2 seconds of your life. Step 4, the snap. Below 85 miles per hour, the nose drops. Hard. You're no longer flying. You're falling at terminal velocity. Step 5, the window. You have maybe 3 seconds where the enemy is in front of you, close enough to hit. Your gun sight is useless because you're falling, not flying. You're shooting by instinct. Step 6, recovery. Throttle to full. Push the stick forward. You need 120 miles per hour before you have enough control. The altimeter is unwinding. 3,000 feet, 2,000 feet, 2,000 feet, 0.500 feet. Pull back gently. Level flight. You're alive. By early 1943, the tactic had spread like a virus. Marine squadrons, Navy carrier groups. Every pilot who saw the gun camera footage wanted to learn it. The old guard hated it. Officers wrote memos warning that this stall fighting would result in unacceptable casualties. One admiral allegedly said, "We're training our pilots to commit suicide with extra steps." But the kill ratios didn't lie. Squadrons that adopted stall fighting tactics saw their loss rates drop by 40%. Joe Foss used it to down 6 Zeros in a single month. Marion Carl credited it with saving his life 4 times. He told a reporter, "The first time I used it, I thought I was going to die. The second time, I knew I wasn't. By the 4th time, I was hunting." Let me tell you about one fight that perfectly shows how deadly this maneuver became when mastered. February 14th, 1943. Valentine's Day. A fighter sweep over Bougainville. 8 Wildcats from VMF 124 are escorting a bombing mission. Mission complete. Climbing back to altitude when the radio crackles. Bandits, 4 o'clock high, many bogeys, coming fast. 16 zeros drop out of the sun. The Americans scatter and suddenly it's 8 individual dogfights across 10 cubic miles of sky. One of those 8 Americans is a 22-year-old lieutenant from Ohio named Robert Gaylor. Before the war, he was a college dropout working in his father's hardware store. War has a way of revealing what men are made of, and it turns out Robert Gaylor was made of something that doesn't burn. Gaylor ends up with 3 zeros on his tail. Not 1, 3. His wingman is gone. He's alone, and he's about to die. He tries every textbook escape. He dives, they follow. He turns, they outturn him. Cannon rounds chew through his airframe. His left aileron is damaged. The stick fights him. He knows he's about to die. But Gaylor is not ready to die on Valentine's Day. So he does the unthinkable. He extends just far enough to create separation, maybe 300 yards, then pulls into a near vertical climb. The zeros, seeing this, think he's made a rookie mistake, climbing when he should be running. They're salivating, throttles wide open, easy kill. Gaylor's Wildcat claws upward, the airspeed dropping like a stone. 200 miles per hour, 150 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour. The zeros are closing, maybe 150 yards now, fingers tightening on triggers. Then, at 120 miles per hour, right at the edge of the stall, Gaylor does something no one taught him. He kicks full left rudder while holding full aft stick. The Wildcat doesn't just stall. It snap rolls, flipping inverted, while simultaneously falling out of the sky nose first. It's a controlled crash, a weaponized disaster. From the Zero pilot's perspective, their target just vanished. 1 second he's there, climbing, predictable, doomed. The next second he's gone, replaced by empty sky. Their brains freeze. By the time their brains catch up, Gaylor's inverted Wildcat is falling past them at 200 feet per second, and he's firing. Upside down, falling, shooting. He hits the first zero in the engine. The cowling explodes. The zero's prop seizes. Terminal dive. He hits the second zero in the wing root. The fuel tank detonates. Orange fire. Black smoke. The aircraft disintegrates. The third zero breaks off so hard the pilot probably blacks out. He's seen enough. He flees. Gaylor recovers from his inverted stall at 800 feet above the jungle. He's so low he clips tree branches with his landing gear. He doesn't care. He's alive. 2 zeros are dead. 1 is fleeing. He limps back to base with 47 bullet holes in his airframe, a damaged aileron, a missing tail wheel, and a story that no one believes until they see the gun camera footage. The footage became required viewing at Pensacola. Pilots studied it frame by frame. The maneuver Gaylor performed that day became known as the Gaylor roll, though Gaylor himself hated the name. He said, "It's not a roll. It's a barely controlled fall that I happened to shoot someone during. But here's the thing about legends. They inspire imitators, and imitators get killed. For every Gaylor or Flatley who pulled off a miracle, there were 3 pilots who mistimed it and died. The technique had a razor-thin margin for error. Too high, and the enemy has time to adjust. Too low, and you don't have altitude to recover. Too slow in recovery, and your engine quits. Too fast on the stick, and you overstress the airframe. The wings fold up, and you ride the fuselage down. Command kept teaching it anyway, because when it worked, it was devastating. It was the difference between a loss rate of 40% and 15%. Some pilots would die learning it, but more pilots would survive combat because of it. And there was something else. Learning to deliberately stall your aircraft built a calm under pressure that no peacetime training could replicate. It taught pilots there's always one more option. One more trick, even when physics says you're dead. Post-war analysis found that stall-trained pilots were 30% less likely to be shot down in their first 10 missions. The reason wasn't the maneuver itself. It was the mindset. These pilots had looked death in the face during training and come back. When things went wrong in combat, they didn't panic. They problem-solved. By 1944, the tactic had gone mainstream. The Army Air Force published Technical Order 1N-15-2 titled Emergency Combat Maneuvers, which included an official description of the vertical stall recovery. The Navy followed with a training film titled Slow Flight Combat Techniques. It was no longer cowboy nonsense. It was standard operating procedure. The pilots who'd been threatened with court-martial in 1942 were now training instructors. But the war was changing. By late 1944, the Allies had achieved air superiority. The Japanese were running out of experienced pilots. The desperate close-range dogfights that had defined 1942 and 1943 were fading. American aircraft were getting better. The F-6F Hellcat could match the Zero. The P-51 Mustang could outrun and outturn the Bf-109. The stall maneuver became less about survival and more about style points. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the technique had been used in combat maybe 400 times total, resulting in 212 confirmed kills. But its legacy endured. After the war, aviation historians analyzing combat reports discovered something remarkable. Pilots trained in stall fighting techniques, even if they never used them in actual combat, had survival rates 25 to 30% higher than pilots who hadn't received the training. The reason wasn't the maneuver. It was what the training represented. Learning to deliberately stall your aircraft built a psychological resilience that translated to every aspect of combat flying. One Hellcat ace with 14 kills said, "Learning to stall on purpose taught me that the rules aren't fixed. That doctrine is a suggestion, not a commandment." When I got into situations where the book said I was dead, I didn't accept it. I looked for the move the book didn't cover. Sometimes I found it. That's why I'm alive. That mindset became embedded in American fighter doctrine. Post-war fighter schools built entire curricula around pushing aircraft to their limits and beyond. Test pilots deliberately stalled jets at 40,000 feet to map their recovery characteristics. Instructors taught students to fly past the published performance envelope. This philosophy led directly to innovations in the jet age. Modern fighter pilots call it post-stall maneuvering. Aircraft, like the Russian Su-27 and the American F-22 Raptor, have thrust vectoring nozzles that allow them to maintain control even when the wings have stopped generating lift. They can point the nose in directions that would have seemed like black magic to Zeke Flatley. It's called the Cobra maneuver, and it serves the exact same purpose as the 1942 stall technique. Create an overshoot, reverse the engagement, take the kill. And just like in World War II, it's controversial. Modern air combat is supposedly dominated by beyond visual range missiles. Why would you need to stall when you can shoot a guy from 40 miles away? But the principle survives, transformed and evolved. The manual isn't gospel. There's always one more move. Let me bring this back to where we started. October 26, 1942. Zeke Flatley standing on Henderson Field, still shaking from adrenaline, trying to explain what he just did. He doesn't have the vocabulary. He doesn't have the physics equations. He just knows that he should be dead, and he isn't. Over the next 3 years, variations of his suicidal stall maneuver would be credited with 212 confirmed kills. Men who should have died didn't. Squadrons that should have been annihilated survived. Flatley himself never used the maneuver again. He was promoted, pulled off the front lines, and spent the rest of the war training other pilots. He was too valuable as an instructor to risk in combat. He taught hundreds of men how to stall their aircraft on purpose, how to fall out of the sky with intent, how to turn physics into a weapon. And then on March 7, 1958, 15 years after the war ended, Lieutenant Commander James Flatley died in a plane crash. He wasn't flying a fighter. He wasn't in combat. He was piloting a routine transport flight, a C-47, from San Diego to San Francisco. Cargo run, milk run, the safest flight in aviation. But 20 minutes from San Francisco at 8,000 feet over the California coast, the left engine quit. Mechanical failure of faulty fuel pump, standard procedure. Shut down the failed engine, fly on one engine to the nearest airfield. The C-47 can fly on one engine. Flatley followed the checklist perfectly. He declared an emergency, turned for the coast, lined up for an emergency landing at a small municipal airfield. He almost made it. He was 200 feet above the runway, speed stabilized, gear down when the aircraft stalled. Not a combat stall, not a deliberate maneuver, just a tragic miscalculation of airspeed and descent rate. The nose dropped. The C-47, heavy with cargo, didn't have enough altitude to recover. It hit the ground nose first at 90 miles per hour. The crash report concluded, pilot error, insufficient airspeed on approach. Aircraft entered aerodynamic stall at altitude insufficient for recovery. The maneuver that had saved his life in 1942, that had become his legacy, couldn't save him in 1958. He knew better than almost anyone alive how to recover from a stall. He'd done it hundreds of times in training. He'd taught it to hundreds of pilots. But knowing and doing are different things when you're 200 feet up in a heavy transport with one engine and 2 seconds to live. There's a gravestone in Arlington National Cemetery, Section 11, Row C, Grave 47. The stone is simple. Regulation military issue. It lists his name, his rank, his dates of birth and death. And beneath those dates, someone had a single line carved into the marble. He taught us to fall so we could fly. That's the legacy of the stall maneuver. Not the kills, not the tactics, not even the lives saved, but the idea that when you're out of options, when every rule says you're finished, there's still a move you haven't tried. It might be insane. It might violate everything you've been taught. But somewhere in that desperate final gamble is the seed of your survival. You just have to be brave enough or crazy enough to pull the stick back and fall. The next time you see a modern fighter jet at an air show, watch it perform the Cobra maneuver. Watch it pitch nose up past vertical, hang there defying physics, then snap back down. The crowd gasps. The announcer explains it's only possible because of thrust vectoring technology, fly-by-wire computers, years of engineering research. But remember where it started. October 26, 1942. A terrified 24-year-old over Guadalcanal who ran out of ideas and decided to try falling. No thrust vectoring, no computers. Just a man, a machine, and the desperate clarity that comes when death is 1 second away. And if you ever find yourself in an impossible situation, remember Flatley chopping that throttle. Remember Gaylor's snap rolling inverted. Remember that the manual isn't gospel. There's always one more move. It might look like suicide. It might break every rule. But buried in that final gamble is your way out. Sometimes the only way forward is to stop moving. Sometimes survival looks like surrender. Sometimes you have to fall for 2 seconds to fly for 50 years. The trick is knowing when to pull back on the stick, when to let physics take over, and most importantly, when to fire. If this story of desperate innovation blew your mind, you absolutely need to subscribe, because next week we're covering the P-38 Lightning pilot who turned his engine failure into a flamethrower and burned an entire German fighter formation out of the sky. The footage is insane. Hit that subscribe button right now. We're going deep into the untold stories of combat innovation, the moments where desperation met brilliance and changed history. These aren't the sanitized stories from textbooks. These are the raw, brutal, beautiful moments where ordinary men did impossible things. Drop a comment below. What's the most desperate comeback you've ever witnessed? In war, in sports, in life. I read every comment, and your stories inspire the videos I make. And remember, when you're falling, make sure you're aiming.